my pleasure this morning to introduce our speaker, Aria Razfar. Aria is an assistant professor at the University of Illinois Chicago, but not for long, because his promotion papers have been through all the committees and they are on the desk of the provost, or the chancellor. One of those desks.
Somewhere.
It's on one of the suits in Central campus, right? So we'll soon be an associate professor there. He has roots in California. He has an undergraduate degree and a doctorate from UCLA. Somehow he snuck in a master's degree at USC along the way, but we'll figure that one out. But we're pleased to have you with us today. As an assistant professor at the University of Illinois Chicago, he's amassed an amazing pre-tenure publication record since matriculating there in 2006 or 7, somewhere in there. Yeah. Lots and lots of wonderful referee pieces in a wide range of important journals, including the Mathematics Educator, Critical Inquiry and Language Studies, Teacher Education Quarterly, Anthropology and Education Quarterly, Mind, Culture and Society, Human Development, a mixed methods scholar. One sees strains of traditional quantitative, ethnographic, and critical methods throughout his portfolio. Not timid in his goals, he has publicly challenged the views of language scholars of the likes of Jim Cummins and Steve Krashen for their comprehensible input hypotheses. He writes for teachers too, on issues of pedagogy and curriculum. He's been very active in securing and implementing grant funds with lots of resources for graduate students from both NSF and OELA. He brings a strong background as a high school teacher, college-bound youth teacher and advisor, and the like. But today, it's his scholarship that we are here to hear about. So please join me in welcoming Aria Razfar.
Thank you very much for coming on a Friday morning. I know I'm competing with a lot of other activities. Today's talk, I'll be talking about repair. Yesterday we talked about learning and cultural historical activity theory. So today I'm going to focus more on the language ideologies piece of my work, and in particular the practice of repair or corrective feedback. Before I go into that, a little bit of the existential question of who am I in terms of scholarly communities. I identify myself with educational linguists, learning science people, and a lot of interdisciplinary perspectives. Mostly people organizing around the central question of the impact of language, whether it's in language arts or in the content areas like mathematics and science. The overall objective, I characterize the overall objective of my research agenda to be the development of a critical language awareness. And by that I mean understanding language as code, as performance, as semiotic, and also as ideological. And throughout this talk, I hope to illustrate how I've been able to contextualize that type of analysis. And another feature of my work is that I'm looking at these issues across multiple contexts, formal schooling contexts and also non-school contexts like after-school clubs and other places in which learning is happening everywhere. So it's important to contextualize that type of analysis in multiple contexts. So vertical and horizontal. As I mentioned, my theoretical positioning, and I mentioned this quote yesterday, that when you look at my theory, you'll see a biography. And you'll see kind of how I bring my personal life and my research goals into a common synergy. And over the last 7 years, I've tried to bring the language ideologies perspective and also cultural historical activity theory to life in teacher education through participatory action research. And that's where a lot of my current projects are organized around, transforming literacy in math and science through action research. I look at the implications and impact of my work in 4 areas. The biggest areas are learning and development, and also the learning and development of teachers and students that the teachers are working with, and also the graduate students, and the faculty that are working with them. And in the recent instantiation of my work, I'm looking at how the issue of language and discourse impacts STEM education. And ultimately, I think because of the framework we're using in terms of language ideologies, there's an inextricable link between language policy, the nation state, and language practice. So the macro-micro connection is something that's very explicit in this theoretical frame. Real quickly, my recent projects, Project Impact, which looks at how teachers appropriate and use and resist language policies in the classroom. I'm currently also working on a project where we're looking at the language attitudes of urban principles, and if you have a question of why I'm calling it attitudes here, I have a story behind that, because it's a big debate in the language ideology literature. Most people who are in the language ideology camp, they are critics of the language attitudes folks. But why did I call this project here? There's an interesting story behind it, so if you want, you can ask me. I'm going to be focusing on the first project and my work on repair since I've been in Chicago to look at a progressive alternative to some of the work I did earlier on repair as a language ideological practice. And so the bulk of the data will be coming from this project, and at the end I'd like to show how this work extended into a classroom at the same school, but organized around mathematics. And I was working in collaboration with West Ed, which is based out here, Carney Clark and her Math Pathways and Pitfalls project, and we started to look at the impact of reframing errors in the instruction of mathematics at the elementary level. So the overall context of my work over the last 12 years, 13 years, is framed by 5 factors. Number one, the English-only movements of the late 90s in California, which you're all very familiar with, Proposition 227, and then Proposition 203 in Arizona, and then Massachusetts. No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, and the Common Core Standards movement, emphasizing accountability measures and kind of bringing in an era of linguistic restrictivism and curricular restrictivism. And of course, the demographic shifts that are leading to large numbers of English language learners, especially Latinos in the Southwest and the Midwest, and even in the South now. And finally, the disconnect between the research by language scholars, and by language scholars I'm using this very broadly, linguistics, applied linguistics, TESOL, psychology, all of the different fields that are foregrounding the role of language in their work. That also frames kind of the context of my work. So one of the questions that I keep asking is that despite all of these trends, the increase in English language learners, despite all of the diversity that's on the ground in schools, why is it that language remains flat? And what do I mean by that? You all know that intuitively, the world seems flat. And that was a very common belief. And those who opposed that view of the world, like Galileo and the likes, were persecuted for it. And when we look at language, and we start with language code, the structure of language, and if we leave the analysis at the code level, I call this looking at language as flat. Not looking at the meaning, not looking at the ideological, not looking at the more esoteric or intangible aspects of language. And we see this persistent pattern, and I'm constantly asking why. Why is the research going in one direction, the demographics going in another direction, and the policy is going in the opposite direction? This is something that constantly bothers me, and constantly is a constant force behind my research questions and research agenda. So there's a little animation for you there. I believe that we can begin to talk about this complex question with an ideological approach to language and literacy. And in particular, I am referring to the language ideologies, plural framework. If we argue that language is critical to learning and development, then it follows that a restrictive language policy will impact learning within all domains, and it will impact all learners, not just language learners, the so-called language learners. Here are some classical definitions of the language ideology framework, and I've highlighted some of the common themes, where language ideologies are our representations, whether explicit or implicit, that construe the intersection of language and human beings. Common sense notions about language, the articulation and the rationalization of those linguistic forms, the self-evident ideas about the nature and function of language, and also, finally, the connection to the moral and political interests that are tied into language use. Most importantly for me is that linguistic form and linguistic function are inextricably linked, and they cannot be disaggregated. And to analyze language without, strictly from a formal level, without considering the function and the ideological, is not a true analysis of what we know about the nature and function of language. So, in my work, I have tried to develop a systematic typology of how we can look at language ideologies in classrooms through the practices, through these kinds of practices. So I've looked at voicing practices, iconization, fractal recursivity, erasure. I've looked at repair, which is what we're talking about today. Affective alignment, meta-discourse, the social organization of learning, student challenges in the classroom, narrative, the use of narrative to construct teachers' beliefs. So I offer the language ideology perspective as an alternative to the traditional teacher beliefs literature. The issue of awareness and the limits of awareness, as Silverstein stated many years ago. And also the role of language ideologies in numeracy practices. What is the role of language when it comes to mathematics? Is mathematics, for example, seen as language-free or cultural-free? And that itself constitutes our ideas about the nature and function of language within that domain. So language practices is a very key construct, key locus for the analysis and the investigation. And these are the questions. What is the nature and function and purpose of language? What is the nature, function, and purpose of language in learning and development? And how are answers to these questions made explicit in everyday language use? And here I mean the code, the performance, the semiotic, and the ideological. So what are some examples of questions that come to the forefront when we take a language ideological approach to the nature of language? The first is what and whose standard? So we all know about the standard English movement. We all know about the official English movement. And you could actually substitute the word English with any language that is tied to any nation state. French, German, Farsi, Arabic, where the official state language is the code and the expected normative symbolic system for its citizens. And it regulates the relationship of the citizens with the state. And in contrast to that is the dialects, the non-standard forms, the language of the non-dominant populations. And this relationship is not a symmetrical one, it is an asymmetrical one. And this cartoon is coming from the Oakland debates, the Oakland Ebonics debates of the late 90s, which was actually the first time where I started to see language as an ideological phenomenon. I was asking, why are these debates? What's all the fuss about? Why is the status of Ebonics, or even what to call it, such a controversial issue? Or Spanglish, or other hybrid languages that are represented by populations that have either been historically enslaved or conquered in relation to the nation state. And their language and their uses is the subject of contestation and controversy. We saw this play out, that language itself is a neutral turf for other political and ideological contestation. Where in the last campaign, we saw Newt Gingrich. Now this might seem like it was 4 years ago, but it probably will play out again this time, except I don't know where Obama will stand in this chapter of that battle. But it was a very controversial issue for Obama to say something like, we should all learn Spanish. And many people on the right started to characterize him as a disloyal American, as someone who is not fit to be president. And so here we see that the debate about language and the debate about the code is fair game. And even though we have something like Race to the Top, which is basically also another instantiation of the restrictive language policy, we see that we are racing to the top of a sinking ship. And language ideologies and mathematics, the same wars that are happening in language, we can see them in math. The math wars, the reading wars, where there's an emphasis on correct form, an emphasis on a narrow view of what counts as right. The myth of an average learner, universal correctness, a purist, idealized form that is only accessible to certain populations. Whether math or language, numeracy or literacy, autonomous views reinforce the status quo both implicitly and explicitly on the micro and macro levels. Lippy Green has tried to argue that English only should be equivalent to color only, or other exclusionary discourses. While I don't fully agree with that equivalence relationship, the sentiment, the underlying position is clear. In that, why is it that we would have an ethical response to these other forms of exclusionary discourses? But when it comes to exclusionary discourses of the nation-state's language vis-a-vis other languages, why is the ethical response different? And that is grounded in a view of language, that language is a choice, language is not a trait, language is independent of people and users, and that is something that the language ideology perspective tries to address, that the language user and the language use are one and the same. So where is it that we see the standards metaphor? And I'm drawing off Lakoff's emphasis on the mind being a metaphorical system. Sometimes standards are okay, sometimes standards are not. If we were talking about a standard shoe, we would say, no, no way. That doesn't work for society. If we were talking about standard shirts or standard clothes or standard pants or standard height, standard weight, these are all seem like nonsensical standards. Standard car, standard healthcare. What about standard mind, standard language, standard learner? So there's a discrepancy in how we appropriate the standard when it comes to various aspects of our symbolic and semiotic lives. And I don't know if you're familiar with this ad. This ad was a controversial ad by Levi's. It was trying to, on the one hand, talk about variation, but the pictures were saying a different message. Michael Silverstein presents an interesting critique of the Linguistic Society of America around the same time these English-only movements were taking place, where the Linguistic Society of America voted on a resolution. And in this resolution, the one aspect of that he says that the critique of bilingual education was never about developing a plurilingual society. The LSA resolution to English only on economic grounds, English language was not only threatened, or all evidence suggests that recent immigrants are overwhelmingly aware of the social and economic advantages of becoming proficient in English. And the critique and required no additional compulsion to learn the language. Michael Silverstein argues that the monoglot standard is so inextricably linked with the identity and unity of the nation-state, it is so naturalized that standard English has a neutral emblematic value for the identity of the nation-state. And his reaction to this resolution was an indictment of the Linguistic Society of America, in that instead of addressing the core cultural issues surrounding language, and the monoglot standard versus the pluriglot standard, he says that this such a wide-eyed innocence, perhaps coming from the referentialist structuralist dogma about what is really at stake for the groups concerned with language in relation to a culture of monoglot standardization, embarrasses me and makes me realize that perhaps my high school math teacher was right when he said that language is too important to be left to the linguists. So these are the questions that I ask, and I believe are critical to the development of metalinguistic awareness in teachers. 4 questions that every educator and researcher of language should always ask when they're analyzing language and when they're analyzing learner. What is the code? What is said? How is it said? Prosody. What is meant? And what are the underlying values and histories and context of what is being said? And these are the 2 questions that are more challenging to develop in teachers and people in general, because it's not as tangible. It's not in the transcript as much. You need more ethnographic context to be able to frame these types of things. Meaning is more esoteric than the code is. And so sometimes, out of convenience, we ignore that aspect of language. So for me, the rubber meets the road. That's rubber meeting the road. That an ideological approach to language necessarily includes all 4. So some people might have the perception that if you're doing an ideological approach, you're only emphasizing the semiotic and the ideological. But I disagree with that, in that when you're doing an ideological approach, you're not ignoring the transcript, but you're not limited to the transcript either. And you're not limited to just one transcript. You're looking at transcripts over time. You're looking at extra transcriptural evidence as well in order to interpret what's happening. In activities designed for instruction and learning, I believe that the practice of error correction and repair is an excellent locus for bringing out an awareness of these 4 questions, especially for teachers to talk about their own language ideologies in practice. Here are some examples that I always get in every semester that I teach linguistics for teachers. Teachers report, we see the student saying we is, shouldn't it be we are? Student says acts, shouldn't it be asked? Finna versus gonna versus going to. Twice as less versus twice as much. Now, no one actually said this. I brought this up from the Eleanor Orr's work on the use of African American English and mathematical problem solving. But I want to talk about how do we address this question. And typically, the reaction is this. What should we do? Once they read my article on repair and we start discussing it and then they bring evidence, their first reaction is, should we correct or not correct? And I analogize these questions to like when my wife asks me, do you see any difference in the way I look? And I know the answer to that question is not yes or no. It's either I'm sorry or I really messed up. So, but you can imagine that within second language acquisition, the field of second language acquisition, that question actually gets answered in that way. Should we correct or not correct? And then there's camp on one side that's in favor of it, and then there's a camp on another. So those in favor argue that error correction leads to metalinguistic awareness, learner perception, recall. And then those against say it's stigmatization, no positive effect, and may even be harmful. But I think this is the wrong framing of the question, and I will try to show how. I believe there's a third option, a third space option to this debate, to this war. And I'm not comfortable using the war metaphor, but that's a metaphor they use. It's always a reading war, a math war, corrective feedback war, linguistic war. That's what I was discussing yesterday with some of the folks. I believe in order to properly examine repair and look for what the answer to that question might be, it's important to step a little bit outside and look at repair and corrective feedback in terms of the language ideologies, the identity, and the ethical implications, and the broader context in which the repair practice occurs, the relational component of the repair practice, the historical relationship that the repairer and the repairee have. These are things that are rarely considered, and repair is reduced to a discrete act in the discussion of the literature. So one of the people who has started to raise this issue is Nick Ellis, and he talks about 3 principles in which we need to interpret repair: social justice, student agency, and socio-cultural tenets of language. As you might be familiar, the concept of repair comes from the conversation analysis tradition, and in that tradition, it's defined as language practices of correcting either one's own speech or the speech of another. For the most part, it is a non-critical or neutral perspective in that the act of repair is simply to maintain conversational equilibrium and serves as a regulatory practice. I argue that the practice of repair is inherently ideological. Why? Because notions of correctness are necessarily assumed by the language users, but the degree of awareness might vary. This correctness is located within a community of practice with interests, values, histories, and short ideologies. And in this practice, I'm also including the nation state. The nation state and its policies of language in maintaining certain relationships in the society and regulating citizenship. This practice can be used to construct differences in status, especially with respect to knowledge and authority and epistemology. Throughout my years examining repair, I've looked at it across 3 contexts with 3 case study teachers. My earlier work was a little more descriptive because I didn't know I was looking for repair. It was something that was part of a broader study. And so I described this phenomenon as a potential type of phenomenon in which we can see how teachers react and reflect upon the practice. The second study, which is the bulk of the study, comes from my work in Chicago with Ms. Ramirez, who's an experienced elementary second grade teacher. And the final example, we have time, is at the same school in a mathematics instruction. And just to mention, Ms. Ramirez was the experienced teacher who was the mentor for Ms. Rodriguez at this school. She was in her first year of instruction. So I'm going to show you a video from my earlier work that I think is what I used to
I don't think we have audio.
We don't have audio? Okay, no problem.
We can play from your laptop, you might be able to hear it.
VGA for
Go ahead and hook up that extra cable that's on the,
Okay.
there's a small wire, yeah.
Headphones.
Ready? Resolution.
Idea so that number one, you get a perspective. When did this person live? Okay? If they lived in the 1800s, you're dealing with a different world, different principles, different ideals. Alright? If you're reading something like this by a woman named Anne Beattie, she's still alive. She was born in 1947, so she's 53, 100. Now, do simple math. It's 2000. Subtract 47 off of 2000, what you get? This ain't a math class? Some more class it is. Okay, so then try to speak in English the right way. Now, ain't. This what? Isn't, right? Isn't a math class.
Okay, so this is an example of a vignette where I show this to teachers, and then I've done the full analysis of this in a paper, so I'm not going to do that here, but I have them react to this because I think all of the issues we're talking about are present in this snapshot in terms of the act of repair, the ideological nature of repair. Technical difficulties. Okay. So we have a prompt from a teacher. This is a literary prompt. He's asking about the age of the author, Anne Beattie. And then we see kind of a spontaneous overlapping responses from students. And one of the students says she's 53. 100. And Mr. Sanders responds to this. She's 53, 100. Nellie, do the simple math. It's 2,000. Subtract 47 off of 2,000 and tell me what you get. And in this context, we have Natalie resist this repair by invoking ideologies of subject domain, saying that this is not a math class, this is not the proper question in this context. And Mr. Sanders' response to her with, picking up on her ain't, use of ain't as a non-standard variety, and that is not appropriate in an English classroom. And you see the sequence that follows where they start to engage in a tug-of-war about whether she should respond or not. At the end, the math question is never answered by Nellie, and the ain't becomes kind of emblematic of an inappropriate language use in an English context. What I have teachers do is reflect on this, and I want to share some of the reflections on the use of ain't. I had one teacher who must have been a very old teacher because he was telling me about Dizzy Dean's use of the word ain't and all the flack that he received for using ain't during the 1941 World Series. And I wasn't aware of this, but this is something he brought up. And it was an interesting story because his use of ain't and his response to it. Let the teachers teach English and I will teach baseball. As for his use of ain't, he said there is a lot of people in the United States who say isn't and they ain't eating. When another critic asked him if he knew the King's English, he answered, yes, sir. And I know the Queen's English, too. Another student brought this quote from Bill Cosby, talking about the use of ain't by African American kids. He says, I can't even talk the way these people talk. Why you ain't? Where you is? And I blamed the kid until I heard the mother talk. And then I heard the father talk. Everybody knows it's important to speak English except these knuckleheads. You can't be a doctor with that kind of crap coming out of your mouth. So here we see that the language structure is more than just a structure. It is inherently ideological, and it becomes a locus for discussion about values, worldviews, and the conflict in the worldviews. Another student brought up the issue, an example from Lisa Delpit's work, where a teacher was correcting a student, and she said, she ain't make no sense. And the teacher corrects her and says, no, she doesn't make any sense. And then the student replies back and says, yeah, but she ain't make no sense. Showing that the language that is being used is not equivalent. It has a different level of emphatics, a different level of emotion. And that not all things are equally translatable. And this is a big issue when it comes to the relation between dialects and standard, because dialects and standard appear to be the same at the code level. They appear to be the same at the formal level. But when it comes to meaning and history, it has very different purposes, and language users know that. This was one of the most dramatic stories that I've seen over the years. Teacher, I like to go pee-pee. Miss R turned around and angrily said, what did you say? I like to go pee-pee. You will go nowhere, young lady, until you ask me in proper English. Now say it properly. I no can. Then you can just stand there until you do. Natasha just stood there as others continued to laugh, and Miss R continued the lesson. A few minutes later, the occasional giggle exploded in a chorus of laughing as Miss R turned to the child. The child was sobbing as she stood in the middle of a large puddle of urine on the classroom floor. So what I want to show is this kind of discussion with teachers is very necessary, and it allows the full range of what the nature and function and purpose of language is at the code level, at the semiotic, at the performance level, at the semiotic level, and at the ideological level. This other story is very similar. I got this email from a teacher after she had read the article, and she narrated a personal story of her own corrective practice. Ms. Rodriguez, shouts David from across the classroom. You finna give us our ice cream party on Friday? My students are promised a monthly party as a solution towards rewarding and promoting students who exhibit positive behavior in the classroom. I turn towards David and respond, you mean, are we going to have our ice cream party on Friday? It was a norm in my classroom to answer to my students in standard English and to have them respond back using standard English as a form of correction. Hence, I became alarmed when David challenged this norm by standing out of his chair, throwing his hands up in the air and exclaiming, why you be always trying to make me like a white dude? My eyebrows raised up perplexed, and my mouth dropped speechless and bewildered at his words. I wasn't always trying to make him be white. What did he even mean by this statement? Was he associating standard English to being white? I'm an Asian American who speaks standard English, yet I don't think I'm white, and David's skin color is black, so how can he possibly think I would want him to be white, or that I even had a choice in the matter? So you're getting the sense that this narrative vividly illustrates how a repair practice and the inextricable link between identity and language, and what Robert Williams said many years ago, that a definition of language is a definition of human beings in the world. So I want to take you now towards what I did based on that work, to look at repair in another context, a teacher that I would describe as having solidarity with her students, having a language ideologies that was very inclusive, very progressive, drew on the native language, drew on the funds of knowledge of the students, and she positioned herself as an English learner and someone who understood the struggles of English learners. And this was a term she used, and this is how I got the idea to talk about repair with confianza and looking at the context and the affective context in which repair practices are situated. Okay, so let me quickly switch back over here. So Miss Ramirez engages in multiple practices throughout the year in building this confianza. She defines confianza as a state of mutual trust, reciprocity. It's more than being nice. It's more than being caring. It is a position of interpersonal and political solidarity with the English learner. The context of the school, I described this earlier, so I'm not going to repeat it here. Methodology I used: participant observation, field notes, video, audio recorded. We began the videotaping in December because of trying to get the students to become more comfortable with the idea of videotaping. And we did full transcription of the code with Spanish translation. We had members of the research team. We had English speaker, Spanish speaker, and the Spanish speaker was very instrumental in providing translation for the transcripts. Semi-structured interviews and the like. Ms. Rodriguez organized learning around thematic units, and the focus of these repair practices comes in the context of those thematic units. To give you a broader sense of the context, as I said, the school, while the school administration was very open to innovation, it was still being met in a culture of curricular mandates, where they had to do their language arts according to a certain prescription, and they had to do it at certain times, a lot like what's happening in California. So this is how she talks about how she establishes confianza in her class. For the first 3 months, which is September, October, November, and well, almost 4 months, I'll do an introduction to English. But during this time, I'm making sure they have literacy skills in their native language, and I'm also helping them develop their higher order thinking in their native language. I cannot wait until they learn English to push them to start thinking critically. So they are doing that in their native language now, and when January comes, I have confidence that they will have acquired enough English to start taking risks and using those skills in their second language. So this is one example of how she does it. Here's Jorge. After the assignment was they were supposed to summarize the author's statement. It was a reading about agriculture and gardening. And not only are they supposed to summarize the author's view, they are supposed to include their own point of view. Now Jorge doesn't do the first part. He just talks about his own view. And so what she does is she asks him to read it. Says, Jorge, léelo por favor. Jorge, read it please. Este cuento me recuerda que yo también planté una semilla de manzana y ha nacido un ramito y todavía yo lo tengo en la ventana, pero necesita el sol. También yo planté una semilla de girasol y una de la cabeza. This story reminds me that I also planted an apple seed and a bunch grew, and I still have it in the window. But it needs sun. I also planted a sunflower seed and a pumpkin. So he's totally off. He's made a total error. He has not talked about what the author's position is. None of that. And now I want to take you through the culture of correction in which Ms. Rodriguez has established here. She says, very good, so she affirms the response, and then says, what do you think about what Jorge wrote? So she's turning the question to the other students. And let me give you a little bit of backdrop here. One of the things that she mentions about this is that even though there's a very restrictive writing curriculum, she has reorganized that curriculum so that she's developing a culture of authorship. She wants the kids to engage in authorship the way real writers do it, where they engage in feedback, revision, and reflection in a community of writers. So she points us, so Miguel answers the question, que escribió las ideas del autor y pero algunas ideas. So this forward slash is also indicative. She's allowing the students as they're talking to self-prepare their own talk. Then he wrote the author's ideas, but some ideas. So the and the but, notice that it's self-correction. Uso espera mamita uno a la vez Miguel que decides tú son las ideas del autor. He used, wait dear, now that's a bad, I'm going to talk about that, that's not a very good translation, but that's the limitations of translation. One at a time, Miguel, what would you say? They are the author's ideas. Y las de Jorge and Jorge's, y uso sus propias ideas. Muy bien, gracias, Oscar. ¿Qué querías decir tú? And he used his own ideas. Very good, thank you, Oscar. What would you like to say? So she's trying to move the student towards the objective of the lesson, which is not only to talk about his own ideas, but also summarize the author's ideas. Oscar says, este casi que hizo las ideas del autor. He almost did the author's ideas. So this is coming from the voice of a student. Miss R. Okay, las ideas del autor. Entonces tú le recomendarías a Jorge que nos cuente algo más de la que decía el autor en el libro. Okay, the author's ideas. So you would recommend to Jorge that he tell us more about what the author would say in the book. So this is part of her explicit strategy, to reframe the feedback and distribute it to the students, his peers, which has a different positionality in relation to the learner. ¿Cuántas manzanas le llegaron? Así es, like how many apples grew, something like. And Miss R says, ¿quiere más detalles de lo que decía el libro? Ok, vamos a escuchar. Gracias, Jorge. A mí me gusta lo que tú escribiste. So here, she finally gives her position as well, building her position through the voices of the students, and stating that what is essential here is more details, and especially the author's position. So this is what got me to think about, look at all the repair practices that Ms. Rodriguez did. And I noticed something very interesting, that she's always using these endearing terms of address. And these endearing terms of address are always in Spanish. And so she's using the native language, she's reorganizing feedback to the peers, she's asking questions, she's also providing the explicit feedback, right? So the kid knows what is expected. And when I looked at all these use of terms of endearment through all the episodes, here are some of the things that were most pervasive. Mi amor, corazón, niños, mamita. And when you talk to Spanish speakers who've been socialized in this culture, they say, well, these are terms that we really can't translate. But they do index a position of familiarity. It blurs the line between the home and the school. And it signals, and it indexes to the learner that we are with you in your struggle to not only make sense of the task, but also the learning of this other code. Another example of this practice in which Ms. Rodriguez builds the confianza is here she says, mi amor, lo que va a hacer, lo que vamos a hacer es que este va a ser nuestros secretos. So she frames this very explicit feedback as our secret. So those concerns that people had about stigmatization, well, those are true. The correction of an error in public can be a very stigmatizing event. It has real social consequences, as you saw in the first episode that I showed you. So here she's framing it very explicitly as our secret, as our thing. Miguel answers, esto se puede hacer así, this can be done well. Correcto, esta hoja donde vamos a organizar nuestras ideas, esta hoja, entonces no se la van a mostrar a nadie, esto es solamente ahora mientras organizamos nuestras ideas. Lo que les vamos a mostrar a la clase es la hoja que tiene la adivinanza. Right, this sheet where we will organize our ideas, this paper, then it will not show anyone. This is only now as we organize our ideas. So she's socializing the child to the writing process, the identity of writership, authorship. And this goes back to the way she's organized learning, a scripted curriculum that is not emphasizing identity as authors. She has reorganized the scripted curriculum to emphasize this culture of becoming authors and becoming writers, that this is a normal part of the process of writing, making mistakes, revising, hearing feedback from peers, hearing feedback from a teacher. So finally, I'd like to talk about where I've moved this work into the mathematical context and kind of a very explicit interventionist type work. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but we've written about this, the development of a meta-discourse to talk about pitfalls in mathematical learning. So this teacher, as I said before, is a novice teacher at the same site. She's working with the first teacher that we talked about. That's the mentor teacher. She's a novice teacher, so she is still learning. And in this paper, we actually talk about how she learns to bring our intervention, which is the Math Pathways and Pitfalls lesson supplement. And just to give you kind of an overall idea what that lesson and supplements are, the overall goal of the Math Pathways and Pitfalls is to first engender discussion, learning mathematics through discussion, and second, to reframe errors as something normative and something positive. Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip all this and show you. So this is how the activity system is as a whole. I'm not going to talk about that right now. How the learning is socially organized using this system, where kids are constantly coming to the wall, constantly talking about their mathematical strategies, constantly writing about their mathematical strategies. So this is the part of this lesson plan that's aimed at engendering discourse. And the way the intervention is set up is that we give them something called discussion builders. So let me give you an example of something like that. And here are the discussion builders that the teachers would use. Something like, I have an idea. I have a question about so-and-so's idea. What would that be true if? So the intervention is meant to bring a consciousness and awareness to the teacher to use these as mediating tools in order to facilitate discussion about mathematical strategies. And there's a regular culture in which the teachers are coming up, the students are coming up, sharing their ideas. And another mediating artifact that's essential to this intervention is the OK and pitfall narrative, where we actually talk about a fictional character who does the problem correctly, and another one that does it incorrectly, but that it's a typical kind of error in solving the problem. So here you have pitfall strategy around fractions and decimals. At the top you have like an OK narrative. And this is all, the kids are talking about that. Okay. Now, I don't have time to elaborate on this right now, but basically when we looked at the teachers' learning of how to implement these mediating artifacts, we saw that in the beginning, they emphasized the form of the discussion builder. So if the student didn't use the discussion builder formulaically, the way the intervention has stated, they would actually prepare the teacher, the student, to use the discussion builder correctly. So here we have an example of the student says, I think, I mean the 38, 7, and the 3 moves to the board. Then Miss R says, use the discussion builder. So the discussion builder here is, I have an idea. And so you see the kid awkwardly use the discussion builder. I have an idea that I think the 7 and the 3 are. Now, what I'm trying to show is I'm using sociocultural theory's premise that learning is the shift in the form-function ratio. So here we see the teacher's learning about the use of the discussion builder, where she's emphasizing the form of it, and rather than the function. When you talk to like the people who design this, they're like, no, we don't want them to use the form necessarily. We want them to engender discussion. So we see that over time, the teachers start to shift towards the function, where that's not that important. You see two shifts happen. One is the modality of the discussion. Rather than using imperatives, goes from the use of imperatives to the use of a more tentative modality, use of could, would, things like that. And here I've highlighted some of that. And then another thing that we started to see was the shift from kind of second-person pronouns to the use of inclusive pronouns. And that's another marker of this confianza or solidarity that we're talking about. Many people have talked about that in terms of analysis, whether it's David Pym in mathematics or Jim G in sociolinguistics. And I think one of the most important things about this type of study is that it creates a very explicit type of intervention to normalize the making of errors. And this is significant for all learners, but in particular for second language learners, because one of the premises of language learning is to engage in risk-taking behavior. And one of those risk-taking behaviors is to be able to make mistakes freely and not be afraid of the social consequences of those errors. So, back to the original question, we is versus we are. Now this issue came into being here this semester a lot with a lot of teachers. And some of my teachers were very adamant that they should be very staunch about this we are. So I kept encouraging the teacher to go and ask the student, why are they using we is? And see what you get. And finally, after 4 or 5 weeks, she went and asked him. And the student gives a very curious, interesting response. He says, because we won, Miss Kate, we family. And I said, well, when you look at the worldview indexed by we is, it's one of collectivity, one of solidarity, one that's grounded perhaps in the history of the African American struggle for identity. That puts a very clear ideological view on this linguistic usage. And the child obviously was aware of it, but you have to ask. You have to be taking that assumption that we talked about in terms of Ray McDermott, that everybody makes sense all the time, and see how the child is making sense of this form. So this got me thinking. I was watching a Laker game, and I never thought the actor formerly known as Ron Artest would become part of my job talk, but I said, why is his name meta-discourse? And I realized it wasn't meta-discourse the way I thought about it, because I was thinking of meta-discourse as a cognitive act, something in the individual. He was using meta to mean the Buddhist term, meaning friendliness, benevolence, the sacrifice of the self, the sacrifice of the ego. And I said, you know what, that's a good way to bring together the meta-discourse of errors and the affective alignment and solidarity into one term. I haven't written about this yet, so it's not copyrighted if you want to. But it made me rethink about Ron Artest as a very deep thinker, as someone who's not just because the first time I presented on this, ironically, Ron Artest got into a big fight in Indianapolis. And I was actually in Indianapolis presenting on this at NCTE. And he charged into the crowd and he was, so now he's all about peace and world peace. Okay, I'm going to, my final thoughts, and then one more, I have to conclude with something else. That in terms of the question of to correct or not correct, I think this is the right reaction because I think it's fundamentally an ethical response. But it's the wrong question. And what needs to be taken into consideration is the broader relational context of corrective feedback and not the isolated act of repair. And so I put this into a poem with the help of a student. I said ain't, you said isn't. I said we is, you said we are. I said ax, you said ask. I said you trippin', Miss C, you said tripping. I said no. Tripping is for the body, but trippin' is for the mind, trippin' is for the soul. Don't worry, Miss C, it'll all make sense. If you ask me more, I am my language, don't need fixin' anymore. That's it.
Thanks so much, Aria. We have plenty of time for questions and comments from the folks in the audience, so we'll just open up the floor now. And Laura.
Okay. Thanks, Aria. The topic of repair is fascinating, of course, and long debated, not only in conversation analysis, but also in other domains. And so you emphasize the practice of repair as ideological, which is another way to say that it's cultural. And I'm more familiar with the work that has been done on error correction or error management as a cultural practice. And that body of research has linked the practice of error correction to local epistemologies and social order. So I would like you to comment on that and how then you kind of reconcile thinking about the practice of repair as a cultural practice with the latest framework that you have suggested, which I think construct the practice as either progressive or restrictive, either respectful or disrespectful, either as constructive or not. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to nuance the way we look at repair, and hopefully we can avoid the dichotomous treatment of repair, and to avoid the question that positions us to say whether it's correct or not correct, or whether we should do it or not do it, and to what you're distinguishing between the cultural and the ideological, I tend to put that into the same category. That the cultural practice is the ideological, in that it's the social organization of the practice, it's goal-directed practices, and there's normative discourses in which kids are being or people are being socialized into and through. So, and that is for me inextricably also ideological, because those are inherently interest-laden, value-laden, and so I don't think that I can, for me, separate the cultural from the ideological. At the same time, I don't want people to read this work and say, well, should we correct or not correct? That's kind of my big message, is that, look, for 5-6 years, that's all I was getting. And I kind of fell into the trap, like, well, don't correct. And I never felt comfortable with the question, because I correct my children explicitly all the time. But I wanted to see that there's a qualitative difference between that active repair or the active correction is so bounded by the relationship of the participants towards a particular goal that you cannot ignore that. And you always have to understand and interpret repair. So like the first example, when I always show that example, people hate that teacher. They say, oh, that's horrible, that's oppressive, what's he doing? I know that when I explain the ethnographic relationship that that teacher has with that particular student, that was a normative practice between him and her, right? And so it would be a disservice to the teacher, a misrepresentation of teacher, to flash that kind of vignette, have people react to it and develop a negative stance towards that person's teaching, and then not understand the full context of what they're doing. And so what I do is I try to show that as a way to evoke the practice in people's own situations, and then you saw some of the narratives that emerged from that, and then make that the platform for the discussion of the more important question, which is what is the nature of language, its functions and its purposes, and to develop kind of a sense of the code all the way up to the ideological. And to me, the cultural necessarily includes the ideological. You cannot abstract that away. So that's the kind of position I'm taking on that issue.
Can I just ask one follow-up? Sure. And then we'll go to Claire. But would you, in defense of the first teacher, would you say that between him and the students, that that's their version of teaching with confianza?
It could be, and see, the thing is, at the time, I didn't have that analytic lens, which actually points to kind of when you're not looking for something, you don't follow up, and you don't. So this is a methodological issue. Now, in my work now, when I look at this, I make sure that I foreground the relational, so that I don't misrepresent the teacher, or so that I can at least nuance the discussion, because that's where I want this to head. I don't want a categorical positioning to be taking place, but to understand that repair and corrective feedback in general is a very complex practice that is almost a necessary practice in the socialization of learners towards any learning goal. And it happens in a variety of ways, but when it's predicated on the relational, it takes on a very different interpretation, and people ask different questions about it, and they become more reflexive about it. And this is ultimately how I see the benefit of this tool in teacher development in terms of the bigger question of developing the metalinguistic awareness.
Okay, we're going to Claire and then Dan.
But beyond the, to pick up on Nara's question, beyond the question that you want the teachers to ask, namely what is the function of language, I would have thought that in that example in particular, are you trying to get the teachers to ask the question, what is my role within the institution? What is my role as a representative of an institution with, that sees its mission or its goals or its values in a particular way? Is that the question you're trying to get the teachers?
That question inevitably comes up.
No, but is it the question you want them to ask?
It doesn't matter if I want it, it comes up because the reason is they are in an environment that is very restrictive towards those non-standard varieties. And so it always, the discussion of the non-standard varieties brings into question the ideologies of schooling. And what is the purpose of schooling? To socialize students to normative ways of talking, normative symbolic ways of acting. And so every time, that's what makes the discussion of the linguistic form so ideological, that you have to now problematize how learning is organized vis-a-vis schooling. And so this leads to a discussion of schooling versus learning, what's good learning, and then at the end, by the time they're finished, they're like, okay, we have to change schooling. Because the way schooling has positioned non-standard varieties and standardized cultural, the symbol systems in which we solve problems and the way in which we make sense of things. And so it raises all of those issues. And that's why I think it's so fascinating that something as innocent as a linguistic form can have all these contestations and conflicts and dilemmas and pedagogies and ideologies of teaching and learning and my identity as a teacher. That's why in the beginning when I used to talk about this, it almost felt like a confessional. I mean, I'm not a priest or anything, but teachers would just come up and they say, I did that and it's horrible what I did. I said, well, I didn't want, I felt like I at least aroused something to now have a discussion about linguistic form and these other things about language that I think might not be available to them in those folk models of language. Right? So now, given the overall objective is to move students from a narrow view of language to a more nuanced and complex view of discourse as something that is situated, something that is ideological as well, I felt like this is the practice, especially in ESL bilingual context, that teachers could, I had a lot of other practice too, but this was the one that gave me like such powerful, evocative results that kind of became the framing to talk about language and schooling and teaching and learner and learning and all these topics that are critical to the work.
Okay, Dan was next.
Yeah. I think I'm going to ask what I heard Laura's question as, and maybe a different question, but because I'm still not sure about or convinced about the answer, so you may just have to keep repeating until I get it. I was just rereading Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro, and he takes white teachers to task for their commitment to inculcating black inferiority. And he says, but black teachers are sympathetic, but they inculcate black inferiority. And so in his mind, the relational exists independent of the kind of what I would take to be the ideological. And so I guess, could you say more about how...
I think this is what I'm hearing from the question, that the ethnicity or the race of the teacher would predict the ideological alignment or the affective alignment with the student and the learner. Is this, am I in the right?
It might predict, or it might encourage a certain sympathy, but not what I would call a kind of, if you will, a liberatory ideology or a liberal one, which is something you seem to be moving toward.
It has the same outcome, and that is that the student is constructed to be inferior, whether it's delivered sympathetically or
so I guess one way for me to ask this is, what is to use the language, the history, the ideology, the context in which you know, mi amor is situated other than a kind of identification with some organic community?
I don't think that that this is predicated on a similar racial identity or ethnic identity in the superficial sense of it. I think that this confianza or this solidarity can be done with anybody who's familiar or who's immersed or who has the practices of that local community. And I think that if we reduce it and have a reductive view that, okay, Latino teachers get it, white teachers don't, or black teachers get it and black teachers don't, I think we run a dangerous path in that we would say that, because I'm separating ideological stances from necessarily how we're seeing like the racial and ethnic identity of the teachers, the identification of the teachers. And so it is possible for a white teacher to develop the same kind of confianza. It is possible for a black teacher to also do the reverse, to, as you said, promulgate the inferiority identity. And so I'm hoping that this work is not implying that only black teachers can work with black students and only Latino teachers can work with Latinos and vice versa. What I'm trying to say is that it is the ideological, not that those things don't impact that, but it is the ideological stance and the focus on the affective and understanding the community practices from its own point of view, taking an ethnographic consciousness to teaching, being willing to move into those worlds in order to engage people in their own terms, in their own symbols. That is something that anyone can do if they're willing to make the sacrifices and willing to travel into those cultural systems. And you're not precluded from doing that if we're going to have this kind of more reductive view of race and ethnicity and simply say this race and ethnicity as trait, like on a census, is what would predict, you know, this kind of outcome. What I'm saying is that these are practices, cultural practices, that human beings can all become aware of and must engage in order to become effective learners of anybody who's in the audience, anybody who's a student in that activity system. So that's my stance. And I realize that sometimes people might go in that direction to have a reductive view of race and ethnicity in relation to language ideologies, and then they might have those kind of conclusions. But I'm emphasizing the practices, and these practices are available to anybody who is willing to have the consciousness about these practices.
Okay, Andy, and then I saw another hand down. Zeus and Patricia.
I just wanted to explore what may be a speech community issue, although I think our speech communities overlap significantly, so I'm not sure. And I'm being kind of picky, but I want to explore, you know, the way that we use words. So you said at one point that form and function are inextricably connected. On the one hand, that's sort of true. On the other hand, it's just flatly false, I would say, from my point of view. They're analytically separable, and any time you have change in forms or functions, the separation is analytically necessary to understand the driving force. If you're a designer, so this is a local context in which this kind of thing is very, very visible. Or evolution is another place where biologists, you know, the game is to put them together because they're obviously different in some sense. I'm a creature with two eyes. What's the function? That doesn't even use the same descriptive vocabulary. So I'm just exploring whether you have that reaction or whether you think I'm wrong, or is it a different community, different way of talking?
I think it's a different way of talking about form and function. By function here, we're referring to meaning and communicative functions, meaning making, sense making. And so linguistic form, so you're referring to like other kinds of more biological functions and those types of issues. And I think form and function in those contexts means something different than it does in the sociolinguistic sense. So we're talking about linguistic form, which is words, sentences, you know, morphology, syntax, those type of things. and kind of the way in which those are used to make meaning. And so from that perspective, the whole point of these forms is to make meaning function. And so that's why there can't be an inextricable link. And yesterday, there's an inextricable link between form and function. The difference is the form is referring to the code, the sounds, and that which is visible to the eye. The function is referring to the imagery, or whatever is not as visible in the social plane of language. So we can both refer to a color like red, but I cannot refer to the image of red that's evoked in your mind versus my mind, or the image of a chair, and so on and so forth. So we can use the word to objectively refer to something, but the image that's conjured is going to be different. That's the area of meaning, and that's what we're talking about in terms of function. How do we analyze that? That, I believe, is analyzed best through ethnographic methods and uses, and being aware of the variety of uses of those forms. But it's impossible from a language point of view to say that it's like the question I was telling you I asked my son yesterday, when kind of the experiments that were done with the metalinguistics, where they wanted to see, they were comparing monolinguals to bilinguals, and Ian Worrell was comparing them, and they wanted to test the kids' awareness, their metalinguistic awareness with respect to language form and language meaning. And so they asked the kids the question, if you were to make up words, could a cow be a dog and a dog be a cow? So her conclusion was bilingual said yes, monolingual said no. I asked my son this question, and he's bilingual by their definition, and he said, why would you do that? Why would somebody just arbitrarily change the forms of words? Can you even do that in real, does that actually really happen organically? Do people all of a sudden decide, hey, you know what, let's just change the word for the hell of it? He said, so right there it showed me he had an awareness. So he had an awareness of language is purposeful. Language is for the purpose of meaning. We have to always take into consideration the audience in which this form is going to be enacted and embodied. It can't be separated. It might be, we could separate it as an intellectual exercise, yes, and that's what linguists are good at. But that's a different exercise altogether. That has nothing to do with the way language is actually being used, right? So this is why I think it's very important to address this question. And it's part of the linguistic desire to become like the sciences. And so by wanting to become the sciences, they create these artificial types of experiments in which they say, oh, what if can you change the label? Yeah, logically you could, but that's not a question that's appropriate to the nature, function, purpose of language, in which how we use it. So I think...
Can I just say, I believe I understood everything that you said. I agree with most of it, but I think you just demonstrated that this distinction between form and function is useful.
It is useful. I never said it wasn't useful. I mean, it's part of the analysis, right? It's useful for analytic purposes. And in fact, that's a very critical part of our analysis.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying in terms of our ideological approach to language, is that we are analyzing the code, we are analyzing the form. But it's necessary but not sufficient to analyze the code, which is what a lot of language people do. They only limit their analysis of language to the code, and this perspective is saying, analyze the code, come up with all the theories of transformative grammar, that's fine, generative grammar, from the move from deep structure to surface structure, that's great. But don't stop there. Go into the generative semantics too. Go into the generative ideologies too. That's where our discussion is with kind of the nativists and a lot of those paradigms which kind of dominate the field of second language learning, bilingualism, and ESL. And so that's kind of, you're getting a little bit of insight into kind of a war in terms of, you know, how we think about language and why we think, we're not discounting the form by no means. We're saying, look, this form should be analyzed, should be looked at, but it has to be looked at in all these other contexts, in its full sense.
So I think it's Zeus and Patricia in that order.
In the categories that you talked about, what was said is the code, how was it said, prosody, what was meant, semiotic, what are the values and histories, ideological. In my understanding of some of the literature on meaning that takes it to the area called hermeneutics, let's say, what's not included there, or at least not overtly, is who said what, right? Which is the older tradition of hermeneutics, psychological hermeneutics, romantic hermeneutics. What mattered was the author, the speaker, the subject. And I see you making a little more gesture towards the later hermeneutics, or the death of the speaker, the death of the subject, as the owner of the meaning. But at the same time, you really are talking still fundamentally about the importance of someone's identity, i.e., who says what matters. Yet you're not going back to the older tradition or more dominant tradition of hermeneutics and meaning. So how are you making sense of how the speaker's identity, who says what, still really matters without what I think you're gesturing towards, which is that it doesn't determine the meaning depending on who says it. So,
well, the individual is part of a social and a public culture, a public language, if you will. And when the individual, so the problem with the older hermeneutics is that it stops with the intentionality of the speaker, and meaning is defined by the speaker, whereas this is taking a more interpersonal lens to the phenomena, and not only interpersonal but also extending it to the state, the macro level. This is what the critical view of language ideologies is moving towards. And so when you look at like traditional speech act theory and where meaning is located in those kind of discussions, it tends to be located in the individual. Language is the possession of the individual. But in this more socially oriented view of language, and then this more language ideology view of language, that meaning is also in the interpersonal, is negotiated, it's an intersubjectivity, and it also extends to the macro state level. And those histories precede the individual. So that when we are coming into a linguistic system or symbolic system, it is not free from the histories of contestation and meaning making. It's something that has a history already, and the individual speaker now starts to dance with those voices. And like, as Bakhtin would say, we start to insert ourselves into voices that have already been historically constructed over many years, and that's the dialogical imagination. And so language is fundamentally public, it's fundamentally social, and this social is now extended to the state and the global as well. So that's my take on that issue in terms of how this perspective looks at communicative practices not from the point of view of the individual, but from in the interpersonal planes in which this is happening, and also taking into account the broader historical factors that have shaped those signs and symbols into this user that we're now observing now. So this history of ain't, for example, did not begin with Natasha or Nelly. It has or the history of ax and ask. It has a broader history. Ax dates back to Middle English. It is not something unique to African American English, but it goes all the way back, and it has many terms and uses throughout time. And so that is part of the analysis, the interpretation. So who is speaking, it matters, but not the who as an individual, the individual as part of a broader historical becoming.
One last question, and that belongs to Patricia.
Okay, I'll try to make it brief. This is a question that picks up on your finding on the just to call it a model of confianza, right? And maybe echoes a little bit of some of the questions that I've heard before with Dan, and possibly Laura. And that is, it sounds like your identification of those terms of endearment, right, as possible signals or you were going to ask about
I know what you're going to ask now.
Okay. that they're signaling, you know, types of affiliation, but at the same time, they seem to also, that you're saying that it's sort of like, it sounds also like part of culturally relevant pedagogy, that if we are aware of these concepts and these terms and these forms of identification, that's how we package, that we can, package is a bad word, but it's like how we can organize learning so that it's relevant to folks in classrooms. And so there are two parts of this question. One is, isn't it a little bit potentially problematic, right? So I'm mitigating here, right? That we think of these concepts and the way teachers use these local terms, right? As sort of like, especially in teacher training, right? Oh, if I learn how to say mi amor, then I can get the students to, you know, then I belong, right? So like that's one, right? And then the other is that in my earlier work in the religious classrooms, I began to appreciate how the mostly Latina from Mexico teachers were actually doing incredibly utilizing totalizing discourses to include in there, we are Mexican, a bunch of other people who were not, and imposing certain practices. And I'm saying this to illustrate that what we term as Latino is actually incredibly varied, right? And so like, you know, I think I know where you're going with the situatedness of your model in social cultural theory, but I just wanted to see, you know, if you can comment a bit on that tension between the teachers do
I've been thinking
in the
about
classroom and what teachers listening to you might do with what they're hearing.
the last thing I want them to do is to look at this model and say, you know what, all we have to do is say mi amor, and we're all good. The reason I say that is because what I was trying to look at is this was one of the practices that was evident in this teacher. It may not work for another teacher to start to use those terms. And in fact, it might have the opposite effect. You might have a patronizing effect. Chris Gutierrez, you might be familiar, she looked at hypermediate, like she looked at a teacher who used this kind of terms of address. And initially she thought that this was building solidarity with the kids, but what she found was the terms of address were actually very patronizing. And the students were not viewed as authentic or whatever. So this is a very complicated issue in the sense that the worst thing that could happen is to look at this work and say, okay, we'll take this piece or that piece and say, this is what would develop confianza. You have to take the whole package and you have to look at the more fundamental issues in terms of how learning is organized. It's like with the movement in the early 70s, the Bridge Project to, okay, if we just start teaching African American English, so you got a white teacher come up and start teaching African American English to African Americans, and all the kids were like, what the hell is she doing? You know, that is isolating particular practices and reducing this broader metaphor of confianza to one or two of the practices. I'm very strict about emphasizing the way I think this work should be read. Of course, you can't control how work gets read. Sometimes a piece of it gets appropriated. To say that when you look at the building of confianza or solidarity, it is not isolated practices that are doing it. It is these practices, it is the learning goal and the activity system and the relationships that this teacher is building with his kids that is mediating the interpretation of these terms of address. Initially I was like, oh, what a great discovery, terms of address. Let me make this the big finding. And I realized that if I did that, it would move in that direction. And I'm always very emphatic about saying that none of these single practices, just like I don't want the repair practice to be interpreted as an isolated practice, to always situate it within the activity system and the way learning is organized longitudinally, historically, in the context of school. So this is an excellent question. I knew somebody would ask this question today. And I probably thought it was you might ask it too, but I think it's a very important question, and I think that especially if we were to use this work to talk with teachers about it, it's very important to kind of unpack that in that way. So.
Well, we're very happy that we didn't disappoint you. I know I can speak for my colleagues in saying that you didn't disappoint us at all. Thank you so much for engaging in conversation about such an important issue. And I want to thank you all for attending. So.